The dust of 1,000 duels settled, but the chill never left his bones. He was the fastest gunslinger in the West, a legend etched in lead and fear. His name whispered in saloons and graveyards alike, a whisper that carried the weight of every life he'd taken, every shadow he'd cast. Yet his final stand wasn't against a living foe, but a spectral echo, a silent accusation that pierced deeper than any bullet. His last duel was against his sister's ghost. This is the story of a man who outran death, only to be caught by memory. Subscribe now, before the echoes claim you too. The wind, a constant companion in the vast, unforgiving West, carried more than just dust and the scent of sagebrush. It carried whispers, faint and insistent, that only he could hear. They spoke of a past he had tried to bury beneath layers of gunsmoke and notoriety, a past that clung to him like the desert's heat, inescapable and suffocating. Every creak of leather, every distant coyote howl, seemed to form her name, a name he hadn't uttered aloud in years, a name that tasted of ash and regret on his tongue, forever unspoken, forever present. His reputation, forged in the crucible of countless quick draws, was a heavy cloak hiding the trembling beneath, the constant tremor of a soul perpetually on the brink of unraveling, haunted by a silence louder than any gunshot. He rode alone, as always, the rhythmic thud of his horse's hooves, a monotonous drumbeat against the desolate landscape, each beat a stark reminder of the solitude he had chosen, or perhaps that had chosen him. The sun, a relentless eye in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows that danced at the periphery of his vision, morphing into fleeting shapes, familiar yet terrifying, always just out of reach, always just beyond the grasp of his desperate, yearning gaze. He was a phantom himself, a legend in the flesh, but a legend built on a foundation of sand, crumbling slowly under the weight of an unseen burden, a secret sorrow that gnawed at the edges of his hardened heart, leaving it raw and exposed. The towns he passed through were mere blurs, faces in the crowd indistinguishable, their fear and awe a dull hum against the cacophony of his internal torment. He sought no solace, offered no comfort. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now held a distant, haunted look, as if perpetually scanning the horizon for something that was already standing right beside him. The fastest gun in the West, they called him, a title he wore like a shroud. For what good was speed against an enemy that had no form, no substance, no heartbeat to stop, only a lingering presence that chilled him to the bone, a coldness that seeped into his very marrow, a constant, aching reminder. His nights were worse than his days, the darkness a canvas for the vivid, unbidden replays of a moment frozen in time, a moment that had shattered his world and condemned him to this living purgatory. Sleep offered no escape, only a deeper descent into the abyss of his memories, where her face, pale and accusing, would materialize from the shadows. Her eyes, once full of light, now held an infinite sorrow that mirrored his own. He would wake in a cold sweat, his hand instinctively reaching for the worn grip of his revolver, only to find the enemy was not outside, but within, an echo chamber of grief and what-ifs, a prison of his own making. The saloon doors would swing open, a momentary burst of raucous laughter and piano music, but the sounds would fade into a muffled drone as he stepped inside, his presence casting a pall over the revelry, a silent acknowledgement of the darkness he carried. He never drank much, never spoke much, just sat in a corner, his back to the wall, his gaze fixed on nothing, yet seeing everything, every flicker of candlelight a potential movement, every shadow a potential threat, every silence a potential whisper. He was a monument to loneliness, a testament to a life irrevocably altered, a soul adrift in a sea of regret, forever searching for a shore he knew he would never reach. He knew this was his last ride, though no one else did. The duels he fought in the dusty streets were mere distractions, fleeting moments of purpose in a life devoid of it, delaying the inevitable confrontation he truly dreaded. The ghost was growing stronger, her presence more palpable, her sorrow more consuming, pulling him deeper into the abyss of their shared past, a past he could no longer outrun, no longer outshoot, no longer deny. The fastest gunslinger in the West was about to face a duel where speed meant nothing, where victory was impossible, and where the only outcome was a final, devastating surrender. You'll never outrun your own shadows. Subscribe to see how they catch him. The air in the small, forgotten cabin, nestled deep within the desolate Badlands, was thick with the scent of old wood and unspoken grief, a heavy blanket that pressed down on him, suffocating any lingering hope of peace. This was where it had happened, where the world had tilted on its axis, leaving him adrift in a sea of despair, a place he returned to not for comfort, but for the raw, unvarnished pain that was his only constant companion. Every splinter in the floorboards, every crack in the mud-chinked walls held a memory, a fragment of a life that had been irrevocably broken, leaving behind only echoes and the chilling presence of what could no longer be. He traced the outline of a faded photograph on the mantelpiece, his calloused thumb brushing over the smiling face of a young girl, her eyes bright with a joy that now seemed impossibly distant, impossibly cruel in its memory. Her laughter, once a melody that filled these very rooms, now existed only in the silent chambers of his mind, a haunting refrain that played on an endless loop, a constant reminder of the light he had lost, the innocence he had failed to protect. The weight of that failure pressed down on him, a physical burden that bent his shoulders, etched lines of sorrow around his eyes, and stole the very breath from his lungs, leaving him gasping for air in a world that offered none. The cabin was a mausoleum of his past, each object a relic of a happier time, now imbued with a spectral glow, radiating a silent accusation that pierced him to his very core. The small, hand-carved wooden bird she had cherished, sitting on a dusty shelf, seemed to watch him, with an unblinking gaze, its stillness a profound judgment, its silence a deafening roar in the quiet of the room. He was trapped within these walls, not by physical chains, but by the invisible bonds of memory and regret, a prisoner of his own making, serving a life sentence for a crime he could never truly atone for, a debt he could never truly repay, a wound that would never heal. He remembered the day with a clarity that was both a blessing and a curse, every detail seared into his mind, an indelible brand that marked him as irrevocably broken. The sun had been high, the sky a brilliant, mocking blue, and the air had hummed with the promise of a future that would never arrive. He had been too fast with his gun, too slow with his heart, too consumed by the world of violence he inhabited, blind to the fragile beauty he was meant to shield, deaf to the silent pleas of a soul he was meant to protect. The memory was a shard of glass in his soul, twisting deeper with every passing moment, every solitary breath he took. The ghost of her presence was strongest here, a cold spot in the room, a faint scent of wildflowers that lingered in the air, a whisper of a dress rustling in the corner of his eye. She didn't speak, didn't scream, didn't rage. Her torment was a silent, pervasive sorrow that mirrored his own, a shared burden that bound them together in this desolate dance of grief. Her silence was more powerful than any words, her spectral gaze more piercing than any bullet, for it spoke of a love lost, a life unlived, and a future stolen, all because of the path he had chosen, the life he had led, the man he had become. He knew she was waiting, not for vengeance but for understanding, for a peace that neither of them could find until their stories intertwined one last time. This cabin, this desolate patch of earth, was not just a place of memory, it was the arena for his final, most terrifying duel. A confrontation not with lead and steel, but with the raw, unyielding truth of his own soul. The fastest gunslinger in the West was about to face an opponent who had already won, long before the first shot was fired, long before the first tear was shed, long before the first whisper of her name. The past always catches up. Don't miss the reckoning. Subscribe now. The air grew heavy, not with the dust of the plains, but with a palpable chill that seeped into his bones, a coldness that no desert sun could ever dispel. He felt her presence now, not as a fleeting whisper or a distant shadow, but as a tangible weight in the room, a silent observer to his torment, her sorrow a mirror reflecting his own profound regret. The cabin, once a sanctuary of childhood memories, had transformed into a spectral arena, the very walls seeming to press in, trapping him within the confines of his guilt, forcing him to confront the truth he had so desperately tried to outrun, to outshoot, to bury beneath a lifetime of violence and solitude. His hand, accustomed to the lightning-fast draw of his revolver, now trembled, not from fear of a living foe, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of her silent gaze. He could feel her eyes on him, though he saw no form, only the shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to coalesce into a shape, a presence, a memory made manifest. It was a duel unlike any he had ever faced, for there was no target to aim at, no flesh and blood to pierce, only the ethereal essence of a love lost, a life extinguished, and a bond shattered, leaving him disarmed and vulnerable in a way he had never known, a way he had never allowed himself to be. He tried to speak, to utter the words of apology that had festered in his soul for so long, but his throat was dry, his voice caught in a silent scream of anguish and despair. The words were meaningless now, too little, too late, echoes of a past that could not be undone, a future that could not be reclaimed. She was a silent judge, her presence a verdict, her sorrow a sentence, condemning him to a purgatory of perpetual regret, a torment that transcended the physical, reaching into the very core of his being, twisting it into a knot of unbearable pain, a constant aching reminder of his ultimate failure. The cabin seemed to breathe around him, the old timbers groaning as if in sympathy with his suffering, the wind outside howling a mournful dirge that echoed the lament of his own soul. He was alone, yet not alone, surrounded by the spectral presence of his sister, her silent accusation a more potent weapon than any bullet, her sorrow a more devastating blow than any fist. He had faced down countless men, stared death in the eye without flinching, but this was a confrontation with something far more terrifying, the unvarnished truth of his own culpability, the inescapable burden of his past. He closed his eyes, wishing for the oblivion that death promised, but even that was denied him, for her presence lingered, a constant, chilling reminder that his torment was far from over. He was caught in a timeless dance, a macabre waltz with the ghost of his sister, each step a painful reminder of what he had lost, what he had done, what he could never undo. The fastest gunslinger in the West, a man who had mastered the art of killing, was now utterly helpless, his skills rendered obsolete by an enemy that existed beyond the realm of the living, beyond the reach of his legendary speed. The duel was not about who was faster, but about who could endure the most profound pain, who could withstand the crushing weight of a guilt that threatened to consume him whole. He knew with a chilling certainty that he would lose this duel, not because he was outmatched in skill, but because he was outmatched in sorrow, outmatched in regret, outmatched by the very essence of his own broken heart. The ghost of his sister was not there to kill him, but to ensure he truly lived with the consequences of his actions, to face the ultimate reckoning. The past demands its due. Witness the final confrontation. Subscribe now. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of an unspoken history, a tapestry woven from threads of love, loss, and an unbearable sorrow that permeated every corner of the small, desolate space. He stood transfixed, his legendary quickness rendered useless, his hands, once instruments of swift justice or brutal finality, now hung limp at his sides, powerless against the ethereal force that held him captive. The ghost of his sister, though unseen by mortal eyes, was a presence more real, more substantial than any living being he had ever encountered. Her silent grief a tangible force that pressed down on him, stealing his breath, crushing his spirit. He felt the cold touch of her memory, a phantom caress that sent shivers down his spine, not of fear, but of an aching, profound sadness that resonated deep within his soul. It was the touch of what could have been, of a future stolen, of a bond irrevocably broken, a silent accusation that echoed through the chambers of his heart, reverberating with every beat, a constant reminder of the void she had left behind. He was a man of action, of swift decisions and brutal consequences, but against this unyielding echo, his entire being was paralyzed, his will shattered, his legendary resolve crumbling into dust. The duel was not fought with bullets, but with memories, each one a piercing shot to his already wounded soul. He saw her face, not as it was in the faded photograph, but as it had been in life, vibrant and full of promise. Then, as it had been in death, pale and still, a stark, agonizing contrast that tore at the fabric of his being. He heard her laughter, then her cries, then the chilling silence that followed, a cacophony of torment that played out in the theater of his mind, a relentless assault on his sanity, a punishment far more severe than any bullet could inflict. He longed for a tangible enemy, a man of flesh and blood he could face down, a challenge he understood, a conflict he could win. But this was different. This was a battle against himself, against the unforgiving spectre of his own past, a past he could not outrun, could not outfight, could not escape. Her presence was a constant, unyielding mirror, reflecting back every mistake, every regret, every moment of weakness that had led to this unbearable reckoning, leaving him exposed and vulnerable, stripped bare of his legendary facade, a mere man drowning in a sea of sorrow. The cabin seemed to shrink around him, the walls closing in, the air growing thin, as if the very space was collapsing under the weight of their shared grief. He was trapped, not by physical bonds, but by the invisible chains of his own conscience, bound to the spectral presence of his sister, forever linked by the tragedy that had defined his life. He was the fastest gunslinger in the West, a master of death, but he was utterly powerless against the unyielding echo of a life he had failed to protect, a love he had lost, a future he had inadvertently destroyed, leaving him with nothing but the haunting silence. He knew this was the end, not of his life but of his torment, a final agonizing surrender to the truth he had so long denied. The duel was not about survival, but about acceptance, about finally facing the ghost that had pursued him across the vast, desolate plains of his existence. Her unyielding echo was not a threat, but a path to a peace he had never known, a release from the burden he had carried for so long, a final, heartbreaking embrace of the past that had shaped him, broken him, and now, finally, offered him a strange, melancholic form of absolution. The echoes never truly fade. Discover the final piece. Subscribe now. The setting sun, a fiery orb dipping below the jagged horizon, cast long crimson shadows across the desolate landscape, painting the cabin in hues of blood and fading light, a fitting backdrop for the final act of his tormented existence. He stood at the threshold, not of the cabin, but of his own reckoning, his body weary, his spirit broken, yet a strange melancholic calm had settled over him, a quiet acceptance of the inevitable. The ghost of his sister, no longer a chilling presence, but a gentle, sorrowful light, seemed to guide him, drawing him deeper into the embrace of their shared past, a past that now promised not torment, but a fragile, hard-won peace. He felt her presence envelop him, not with the cold touch of dread, but with the warmth of a forgotten love. A silent forgiveness that washed over him, cleansing the years of guilt and regret that had clung to his soul like a shroud. The duel was over, not with a bang, but with a whisper, a silent understanding that transcended words, a profound connection that bridged the chasm between life and death, between the living and the spectral. He had faced down countless men, but this was the only battle that truly mattered, the only victory that held any meaning, a surrender that was, in its own way, the ultimate triumph. The memories, once sharp and agonizing, now softened, losing their power to wound, transforming into bittersweet echoes of a life that had been, a love that endured beyond the veil of death. He saw her smile, heard her laughter, felt the warmth of her hand in his, not as a torment, but as a cherished remembrance, a precious gift from the past that had finally found its way back to him. The fastest gunslinger in the West, a man who had lived by the gun and died by the ghost, was finally free, unburdened by the weight of his past, released from the chains of his own making, ready to embrace the quiet oblivion that awaited him. The wind, once a carrier of whispers, now sang a lullaby, a mournful yet comforting melody that carried his weary soul towards a final rest. The cabin, once a mausoleum of grief, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where two souls, long separated by tragedy, could finally find solace in each other's presence, a silent reunion that transcended the boundaries of life and death. He had spent a lifetime running, fighting, killing, but in the end, his greatest act was to stop, to surrender, to allow the ghost of his sister to lead him home, to a peace he had never dared to dream of, a quiet, eternal embrace. His legend would live on, whispered in saloons and campfires, a tale of the fastest gun in the West, but the true story, the one that mattered, was known only to him and the spectral presence that had guided his final journey. It was a story not of bullets and blood, but of love and loss, of guilt and redemption, of a man who found his ultimate duel not in the dusty streets, but in the silent chambers of his own heart against the most formidable opponent of all, his own conscience, personified by the ghost of his beloved sister. He had faced his demons, and in doing so, found a peace that no living man could ever give him. As the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon, plunging the world into a profound darkness, a faint, ethereal light seemed to emanate from the cabin, a soft, glowing embrace that shimmered for a moment before fading into the vast, silent night. The fastest gunslinger in the West was gone, his legend etched in the annals of the frontier, but his soul, finally at rest, had found its eternal peace, forever bound to the sister he had lost, forever free from the torment that had haunted his every step. The last sunset of a soul had arrived, bringing with it the quiet, profound stillness of true absolution. The final chapter is always the most profound. Subscribe to uncover more untold stories.